Victimization ultimately can take many forms, and research shows that the context of the crime ultimately shapes the experience of the victim as well as the handling of the crime by enforcement. When we talk about instances such as stalking, we notice that there is a very severe lack as far as response from enforcement. Only about 40% of victims said that police did anything when they reported stalking, and 8% or less than 10% at least of the stalkers were actually arrested. Stalking is defined as this dynamic, essentially, where one person is giving the other person an extreme amount of unwanted attention that's making them feel uncomfortable and unsafe, and there, according to the textbook, it's good reason for people to feel unsafe. And when I say people, typical victim is a woman, and the typical motive is the typical stalker is motivated by dominating her because she is a past lover. But there's a good reason for those people to be fearful, because apparently 30% of women who had been murdered had also been stalked before the murder actually took place. So there's really not a understanding why there is not more engagement from police, because it's mostly a matter of psychological safety, and a lot of the acts being committed are not inherently criminal. When it comes to cyber stalking, that's deemed as even safer, because you do not necessarily have to interact with necessarily everybody you know online, and it's also perceived as just shorter in duration and not as life-threatening. But when we move on to workplace victimization, there are some people that we don't necessarily think about that are victimized a lot, and it's most people who are public-facing that are vulnerable to workplace attacks. It's shown that it's usually robberies, so those who are handling cash are some of the most risky, and those who work in transportation and mental health. These are just people that have to face the public, and the public is just such a mixed bag of individuals. If you work in a law firm, for example, you are meeting with just a certain population. If you work in a school, you're ultimately working with a certain population. But if you are a taxi driver, which is apparently the most dangerous job, you really do not know ultimately who you are going to be serving, and people take advantage of that. And we can prevent the textbook notices, by engaging in de-escalation training, teaching employees how to handle customer service moments, and ultimately there are laws now to provide employees with a safe work environment because of this. But there are 67% of this is robbery, so it's not coworker to coworker violence, which is interesting. There are some community-wide crimes, so there are hate crimes, and it's just when people are motivated by pure bias. And these have to be differentiated from regular crimes because they ultimately affect a community and are echoing, again, a sentiment that is harmful to society. So those need to be punished accordingly. And when we were talking about college and middle school and high school crime, there's also been more of an engagement in terms of enforcement and responses. There are now rules that colleges have to report every single crime that happens on their campus for the academic year, so that students that are prospective and current are able to know. And luckily, the NCVS indicates that victimization rates have declined from the 1990s to mid-2010s, which is ultimately affecting that crime rate in the country overall. And we have seen that those who are on campus are actively safer than those of the same age group who are not on campus, which is interesting because it also echoes the sentiment that those who receive a higher education are actually less likely to be victimized. So whether that is the chicken or the egg, I do not know, but there could definitely be a relation. But all these different instances are not necessarily related. The only thing they have in common is that how they are handled is based upon how important society deems it, such as stalking is not necessarily deemed as super important because they're not technically legal acts, it's just making the person feel unsafe. But when it comes to hate crimes, we have to put more emphasis on